All right, we might move on to our next presenter. So I would love to introduce Darren. Once again, he will talk to you about the content of his presentation, but equally importantly, I found out that for those of you who've just joined us, because we're talking about educational technology, I've asked the presenters to share their go-to can't live without piece of kitchen technology. And Darren's told me that his is a blender, and for the versatility of all the different types of drinks that can be created using it. So over to you, Darren. Once again, please put your questions in the chat box, and Darren, I'll give you a warning at 13 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll just share my screen with you and get this popped up there. Right. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Yeah, my name is Darren Turnbull, and I'm a PhD candidate at CQUniversity. My supervisors are Dr. Ritesh Chugh and Dr. Chugh. I am conducting this presentation from Tweed Heads in northern New South Wales, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm making this presentation today. And yeah, I do like blenders. They are pretty cool things, and I couldn't do without one. My topic today, or my presentation today, focuses on a literature review of the research methodologies of user perceptions of learning management system efficacy in Australia and China. And that really sounds like a mouthful and a rather bizarre and niche sort of topic to look at. And so I thought what I'd try to do is put it in context of my PhD project. And in my PhD project, what I'm trying to do is to look at the enablers, barriers, and challenges of implementing learning management systems in China and Australia, two uniquely separate contexts. And through this research journey, I developed an interest in understanding not only the outputs of empirical research, but actually the methodologies that go behind the research as well, including the decisions for choosing particular methodologies. So this particular presentation looks at the results of a literature review investigating methods employed by existing empirical research into user perceptions of learning management systems in these two very different environments. So what I thought I'd do, and my previous presenter actually was very good in actually defining what an LMS is, but in the context of this research, what I mean by an LMS is any online learning platform such as Moodle, for example, or Blackboard, that can be used to assist in the deployment of courses, whether they're online or whether they're face-to-face or whether they're in a blended mode, and assist learners in their learning journey, whatever particular course that they're in. So this particular study had three important research questions behind its, or driving its development. The first one was, I'm just trying to get rid of that over there, thank you. The first one was, what are the research methodologies, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, used by empirical research studies in the perception of LMSs in Australia and China? So in the first question, I was trying to look at a way of classifying whether an approach was purely qualitative, whether it incorporated the best traditions of both qualitative and quantitative approaches, or whether they were mixed method studies. In the second question, which I think is the more interesting one, I was looking at more the motivations for conducting a particular study in terms of whether they were confirmatory or exploratory research approaches. So by exploratory research approaches, I'm looking at whether the thrust of the research was actually to develop new theory or new understanding of relationships between variables, or whether it was confirmatory in nature, that is, validating or not validating an existing theory in a particular context. Lastly, the third question, what are the data collection methods used by empirical research studies in the perception of LMSs in Australia and China? So, for example, what sort of data collection tools are they using? Interviews, surveys, focus groups, and what is the frequency of use of those sorts of data collection tools in the studies that I was looking at. A little bit about the method of this review. I looked at empirical research papers over a 5-year period.
Darren,
Yep.
Chugh here.
Yep.
The slides aren't moving in the presentation.
The slides aren't moving. Well, that is rather weird. Okay, so you should be looking at the second slide.
So at the moment it's still
introduction. Should have introduction.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought
I'm still at the right place. Sorry, Joe. So in the research methodology, I looked at papers over a 5-year period, 2014 to 2018. I was specifically looking at quality databases, analysing the abstract of those databases, and in particular, a paper had to have a well-developed methodology section in order to be able to make a judgment about the research design that was actually adopted. And it was interesting that maybe 25–30% of the initial papers that I looked at really didn't have much in the way of a methodology section at all. They went straight to the output, to the discussion, without adequately explaining the thinking that went behind their research design. So as a result, this study yielded 14 papers with an Australian focus, 9 papers with a China focus. And while the number of papers that come out of this study may seem small, the criteria was very narrow, particularly focusing on learning management systems and those papers that had a well-developed discussion section that could actually give an idea about some of the thinking that went behind the methodological choices that were made in setting up those studies. All right, so moving on to the interesting parts, what are the results of all this? Well, I thought I'd present those by a research question. And the first research question looked at the type of research by country. I've got a little graphic there showing mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative research. You can see that in Australia, the majority of papers were qualitative. In China, there tends to be an even mix between quantitative and qualitative papers. Qualitative and mixed methods papers, rather, and there is one qualitative paper amongst the research papers that I examined. The interesting thing here is that why are all of the quantitative papers actually occurring in China and none of them occurring in Australia? I just want to clarify what I mean by a quantitative paper in the context of this review. A paper was classified as quantitative if it substantially used or exclusively used statistical tools to analyze numerical data to produce a quantitative result that was evident in the discussion and conclusions of the paper. If a paper had, for example, a qualitative element in it, no matter how small, perhaps a thematic analysis of interviews that complemented a largely quantitative study, then it was classified as mixed methods. So amongst those quantitative studies that were in this review, there was one study that was on the perception of student online learning, another on emotional management of online group work. This is within China. There was a study that attempted to verify an online learning model in a Chinese context for Chinese learners, and another that looked at the motivational differences for online learning between the US and China. And that study basically took data collection tools and methodologies and tried to apply them in a Chinese context. So it's interesting that none of those studies actually had any qualitative element to them, that they were all quantitative. And it's always interesting to speculate on the reasons for this. Some researchers believe that because of the high volume of participants that would be involved in any research looking at user perceptions of technology, then quantitative methods may be favorable because of the large number of participants. And surveys, for example, are a great tool for dealing with data from large numbers of participants. Another suggested reason is because this study focused on English language publications, there is a perception in some quarters in China that major journals have a preference for quantitative studies. That apparently is the perception in some quarters in China. And so there's a tendency among some quarters to actually adopt quantitative methodologies. Last reason is that I think Chinese researchers are not shy of learning mathematical and statistical techniques, and so they may be naturally attracted towards that camp or that methodological camp. And also, if you are delivering findings in a language that isn't your target language, then the nuances of the language may make it easier to present quantitative findings than it would be qualitative findings from qualitative research. So those were some of the interesting things that came out of that first research question. Whoops, I've gone back too far there. Sorry, I'll just go back to the second research question. But I think this is the more interesting one. Confirmatory and exploratory research by country of focus. So here we're looking at what are the motivations for a particular research effort. And interestingly, you can see that in Australia, they were all exploratory, but there were 4 confirmatory papers that came out of the review of Chinese empirical research. Now, little note that I've made there, exploratory approaches suggest commitment to exploring new approaches. And you can see that that pretty much was the case for all of the LMS related studies in Australia. They all sought to look at the application of learning management systems in particularly different contexts, some of them new and novel. In China, there were some exploratory papers as well, but interestingly, 4 of them were confirmatory in that they attempted to validate existing theories or data collection tools, for example, in a Chinese context. And 2 of those studies coming out of China were confirmatory in the sense that they looked at overseas research and tried to replicate that in China. And 2 of them looked at existing theories in a generic sense and then sought to find the applicability of those theories in a Chinese context. So once again, the interesting finding, confirmatory papers tend to be more prevalent, at least with this little niche area of learning management systems in China than they are in Australia. On to the last research question, which looked at the data collection tools by country of focus. There were 8 of them.
Excuse me, Darren.
Yes.
You have 2 minutes to go.
How many? 1 minute?
2.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, I'll go faster. So we looked at the data collection tools by country of focus. The most prevalent there were interviews and surveys, possibly because in the case of China, surveys were more prevalent, perhaps because of the large number of participants that are involved in studies involving an analysis of user perceptions of technology. Finally, in my last couple of minutes here, what to take away from all of this? Well, in any sort of cooperation that we have with overseas organizations, whether it be in a purely research sense or it's organizations or people that are trying to cooperate with other organizations and people abroad, there's usually a research component behind any of the data collected. So for example, if you're a learning management system developer and you are looking to deploy a system, let's say for argument's sake in China, then you might be making decisions based on information you're getting from Chinese counterparts. But what is the source of that data? How was it generated? What are the methodological choices that led to the generation of that data? Because that's important in determining the quality of the data that goes into the decision-making process. Last point that I'd make is that this is a very specific focus on learning management systems, a niche area of technology. There's a need for more research, and it would be interesting to broaden the scope of a study like this to include maybe the broader field of education technology, and obviously looking at different countries and contexts would be interesting as well. So I've got a full link of the article there that's been published. If anyone's interested to it, in reading it, I can share that in a link. I think I'm just about up for time, so thanks very much for listening, and I'm open to any questions if I have any time for those. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Darren. And Ritesh has also put up a link in the chat box if people would like to follow that. Darren, that was quite interesting. I'm in the throes of a PhD as well, so I get the joys of the literature review. Was there any part of what you found so far that surprised you?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the confirmatory studies in China and the lack of them in Australian context, I think was surprising. So it would be really interesting to expand the scope of this study to see if that's more generally the case with other disciplines, and also to look to see what might be the case in other countries as well. But that really surprised me. And also the fact that purely quantitative studies, there tends to be a prevalence of those in China, and more of a mixed methods tradition that might take place in research in Australia. So those were the things that surprised me.
Excellent, thank you. Does anybody else have a question for Darren?
I have a question, if that's okay, Susan. It's a bit of a curly one, Darren. I'm particularly interested in the mixed methods stuff, and whether or not the mixed methods studies you identified were sequential mixed method studies. So do they tend to do quantitative stuff and then qualitative stuff to follow on? Or do they do more triangulation where they're trying to kind of collect both the rich data and the survey data and sort of mix it all, stir it all together, you know, which one?
There are also exploratory sequential mixed method studies, so starting with a qualitative analysis and then using quantitative techniques as a follow-up to verify some of the findings in the qualitative studies. That was the tendency. But the surprising thing again was I guess the lack of qualitative input into the confirmatory studies that I looked at, taking a purely qualitative approach to look at issues that you think really would have a qualitative dimension to it. That was really surprising. But yeah, they were mainly exploratory mixed methods approach.
And you said that happened more in Australia, the confirmatory sort of quantitative stuff?
No, there were no confirmatory stuff in Australia. That was based on the classification system that I applied. That was the interesting phenomenon. Obviously, there's a confirmative element of any mixed method study that you do in many cases, but I was looking mainly at the research aim, the motivation behind the study. What was the main thrust of it? So I made a sort of call as to whether the main thrust was looking for new ground, new insights, or whether actually trying to confirm whether an existing theory was applicable in a local context.
I see. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Darren, just a couple of other quick questions that came through, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. But you've been asked, is there a particular reason why you chose China as your second country? And is it, and somebody's posed the question of whether Australia's just at a different stage of research to do with LMS.
Okay, so to answer the first question, I chose China because this review fits into the major project that I'm doing in LMSs, and so I wanted that to feed into the broader research that I'm doing on LMS research. I'm sorry, your second question was of China may be different.
Somebody was just asking, is it just that Australia's at a different stage of research in general, or specifically to do with LMS?
Well, I think this COVID-19 crisis has sort of provided a lot of light on what's valued and what isn't. I think there's more of a tradition in China that devalues online learning, at least historically that's been the case, and so there's less work that's actually done in that space investigating the effectiveness of online learning because it's not valued so much. And it was pretty clear to me that it's just how awesome some of the research effort is in Australia and I guess other countries in this online learning space, and it's really coming to the fore now. And I think that answer your question, yeah, I think in terms of this particular online learning, I think, yeah, Australia may be at a different stage in China, absolutely, although it's catching up fast as COVID-19 is sort of...
Excellent, thank you very much for that. Would you please stop sharing your screen so our next presenter can get themselves organised?